Hello and welcome to the second video in the series by me, Al McClenaghan. I play as MD261 on PokerStars, and I'm fortunate enough again to be joined by Tom Looseboy Loose.
Hello, Al.
Yeah. And first of all, thanks for coming along again.
Yes, no problem.
And what we're going to look at in this video is the common mistakes made by Regs, by sort of professionals or semi-professionals, people who play a lot of games, have a large chunk of their income made from poker, but maybe haven't quite hit the level of some of the other regulars about there, and often there's common mistakes and common pitfalls that players like this tend to make, and there are a lot of them are understandable, and they're ones that you would make unless you know how to avoid them really, and that's what we're going to look at in this video, how to avoid the common mistakes. If you're aware what the common mistakes are, and you realise that these things which you may be thinking yourself are mistakes, then it's a lot easier to correct them.
Now, it's fair to say that most of these mistakes are reversible, except for the one depicted in this picture right here.
So, what are the common mistakes? And there's lots of ones that you can look at, but what we're going to focus on are some of the ones which are really important, not necessarily just on the tables, but they're really common ones which can make you unhappy playing poker, because by not knowing about these things, you don't understand how poker works as a game, especially if you're thinking of maybe doing it professionally or already doing it professionally. So we could have picked from a whole range of them, but these are the ones which we figured were the most important. And a lot of them come down to things that you will hear people say. I can wait for a better opportunity. I can play a table if there is a fish or if there's only 2 regs or 3 regs. I can control my results. People tend to think that if they run bad over 1,000 games, that some way that is their fault. It could well be, but you need to understand variance to really know how this all works. I can't do this move with this hand. I can't re-raise here with this hand. I can't re-shovel in as the medium stack. These are oftentimes things which are generally correct, and when you're learning without understanding the game, when you're first picking it up, it's good to have guidelines. But when you get to a certain point, you really want to understand the game with a professional to make sure you're doing what is going to maximize how much money you make. Rather than thinking, this hand, in this situation, I can only do this, you really want to look at people's ranges, your equities, your fold equity, your showdown equity, to make the correct moves. The red line is truth. We'll get into that in some detail later.
You might just want to explain that the red line is in fact the adjusted EV line in Holder Manager.
Yeah. I think it might be the blue line in Poker Track, I'm not exactly sure, but it's, yeah, as Tom said, it's the adjusted EV line. And the last one we're going to look at is setting goals. Be it, I'm going to become Supernova Elite, I'm going to rake at least this much money in the year, I'm going to play 40 hours a week, I'm going to make $100,000 this week. Well, if you don't set goals correctly, you make yourself very unhappy, and you also lose a lot of self-esteem if those goals are perhaps not realistic goals, or goals which you either have to fail, or if you achieve them, they don't really make you very happy. So the first one, and this is perhaps the most common justification you can find for a lot of people making a lot of moves, or often passing up on a lot of moves, is I can wait for a better opportunity. This is the kind of situation you often find people mentioning something like this on. They're facing a really marginal spot, they're not really comfortable with it, and they go, it could be very wrong if the guy's pushing tight, and even if it's right, it's not, maybe it's not that right. I mean, I'm only going to win a bit of money doing it, so I can wait for a better opportunity. I have a skill edge, I don't need to take this risk, even if it is positive EV, because I can wait for a better opportunity. So the first thing that you really want to look at in a spot like this is, well, just how positive EV is the move. So let's have a look at sit and go with for this particular situation. So here is the situation, and obviously a lot of it depends on your opponent's pushing range. If your opponent is pushing a pretty conservative range, you're not going to want to call here, but sometimes you come up against opponents who you suspect might be pushing something like 65%. Often it's another reg who perhaps had you pegged as a bit tight in this situation, and they may be pushing 65, 70%. And what you'll find there is, in a spot like that, in this case, you would pick up 1.8% of the prize pool almost by making that call, which is a huge amount. If the prize pool is $100, that's $1.8 pretty much right then and there. But even with the more marginal ones, you need to break down what exactly it is that you mean when you say I can wait for a better opportunity. When you say something like that, you're in essence saying I will pass down a positive money EV spot, a spot where I can expect to win me money here, because it's too marginal, and because of my skill edge I will get a better spot elsewhere.
That's quite difficult to quantify, really. Because of my skill edge, you're basically saying, what is the quality of the other players at the table, what are the blinds at the moment, reasonably, what kind of edge can I expect in this table if I pass up on this situation, and that's usually quite difficult to quantify.
I'm so glad you said that, because this is the amazing thing. Your edge does not depend on you at all. Yes, I mean, obviously you need to be a good player to have any kind of edge, but it's all relative to what's going on at the table. If you have 6 players left and the blinds are huge and you all only have 5 big blinds, believe it or not, you're not going to find an opportunity to exploit any skill edge when you're all cripple stacked. If you are maybe on the bubble really deep stacked against 2 fish bowls, you certainly will have a skill edge because they will not understand ICM and make big mistakes. But it all depends on how much ability there is to play left, how many more hands you're likely to see. If the blinds are high and your stack is low, you're not really going to be able to create a positive EV chance, and the skill level of the other players. At the end of the day, if this table had 4 regs who are of equal standard to you, you should not give yourself any kind of edge. And the way that you want to quantify it is, and it is hard because it is an opinion thing, but it's the edge function. You don't say King 7 suited, it's marginal. You say, on this table, I would pass up an opportunity even if it was going to win me 0.1% of the prize pool, because I believe that even 10 big blinds deep only, if I'm this shallow stacked, I can have a more positive EV. I can expect to have more positive expectation chances than this. And you put that in and you see what it does to the calling range. But it is important to separate what is the correct move from what you think your edge is. One of the biggest things that will often happen is as a professional, you're constantly fighting your instincts and your urges. They're one part of your brain, your almost more primeval brain, doing the thing that you want to do that makes you comfortable, fighting against what you actually know, if you're rational and take emotion out of it and just think about it, what you know to be the best move. And this is the way that you need to do it. You need to quantify what your edge is and then see how it affects things.
It may be worth adding that quite a lot of regs, especially the tighter ones, people who are less well advanced, will maybe call a lot tighter than they should. In terms of they'll pass up on these, must say, marginal or small positive EV spots, but only really when it comes down to calling, and that's probably because of the fact that people aren't too sure about what their calling range should be depending on other people's pushing range. I mean, as you can see here, your calling range includes hands like King 5 off, Jack 10 off, Queen 6 suited, hands that you wouldn't usually expect to call with, and so it's quite a big step for you to call here, potentially with a hand like Queen 8 off suit, when you're used to basically playing premium hands. And sometimes the real way you can obviously learn is by using sit and go whiz, but occasionally making a call that you think is fairly borderline, then reviewing your play afterwards with sit and go whiz to find out whether you were correct or not. Sometimes you will make mistakes, but that is just all part of the learning experience.
Yeah, often you'll find that people who make in marginal spots will always tend to go one way or another, and that will be based on what they are more comfortable with. So a tight player will call far too tight in all the marginal spots because he thinks, it's marginal, I'm going to call, I'm going to fold. Whereas an aggressive, kind of more reckless, more pride-filled player will always call in those spots because he doesn't want someone to take advantage of him. Neither of those are reasons to do either. You just look at it in terms of, what is my expectation? Is it positive EV? How much of an edge do I have? Is it still positive EV beyond that edge? And if it is, you call, and if it isn't, you don't. And part of the reason why it's so very difficult is, let's say that you do believe your opponent is pushing 70.4% and you are holding a hand like, let's say, King 5 off, and you've given yourself this small edge, a reasonable edge, and it is a marginal call. The problem is, for this call to be correct, the opponent does have to be pushing 70%, and you're not going to see 10-5 off and Jack 2 off and 9-4 suited, the real bottom of his range, very often, because most of his range is made up of better hands. So the chances of you actually seeing the hand that makes it correct for you to make this call are really low. He may turn over Jack 8 offsuit, and if you are maybe a bit lacking in confidence in your game, you'll think, oh, what a terrible call. Maybe he's only pushing with Jack 8 offsuit, in which case I lost so much equity by making that call. And it's tough. You never see the bottom of someone's range, or it's very rare to see the bottom of someone's range. But
this is where, you know, using a HUD is really very advantageous. You can obviously see people's past actions, but in addition to that, obviously paying attention to the table is very important. You know, if you can see how exactly someone has played in the last 4 or 5 blind levels as the blinds have gone up, and in addition to that, I mean, there might be a small aspect of metagame. You know, you might play with this player before, and you might, you know, kind of can estimate his pushing range from previous encounters.
Absolutely, and if you are playing against a good reg, if you do not call with a hand like King 7 off, then as an opponent, King 7 suited, you know, if you're going to be calling a range like this, well, suddenly, even with a small edge, another reg from the small blind can suddenly play at 100% of his range profitably. In a spot where he should not be able to do that, you now give him a way to play 3-2 offsuit in a positive EV fashion. It's very easy to exploit you.
So really, the advice here is, you know, if you're in the big blind here and you've seen someone push into you from the small blind the previous 4 times when they've got, you know, around 10 big blinds, you should probably assume that they are pushing somewhat close to 100% and call accordingly, and not be too scared to make that call.
Yeah, it's often quite embarrassing, particularly if you're calling another reg. You show down your King 5 off, he shows down his Ace Queen off, and you think, oh no, he just saw me calling with King 5. But it's fine. That is actually a good sign, because it means that you're thinking about the correct things, which is, what is his pushing range? What is positive EV for me to call with? And if you do think that you can wait for a better opportunity, you have to think, what kind of edge am I talking about? Because often you will find people who will fold the King 7 suited here in that spot, and they pass up on over 1.5% of the prize pool. So it can be really costly. You really need to try and quantify what you think. And another common mistake is table selection. I'm a big believer in table selection. I think that it's going to be worthwhile to spend a reasonable amount of your attention when you're playing, making sure the tables you're playing are ones where you can expect to make as much as possible. Yes, if you spent all your time table selecting, you would have a lower hourly rate, but if you spent none of your time table selecting, you would also have a lower hourly rate, and it's about finding that balance. Table selecting is boring, table selecting is dry, no one likes it, it's the worst part of poker, but the amount of attention, the percentage of attention you should give to picking good games should be what will maximise my hourly rate, not I hate table selecting. And when you really look at table selecting in depth, there's quite a lot to it. I mean, you'll find a lot of people, everyone thinks they table select, or almost everyone thinks they table select.
And everyone does, but, you know, it's all relative. You know, certain people say, you know, I won't sit in a game, you know, if there's 2 or more regs, essentially. That is some form of table selecting. Yep. Maybe not the optimum.
Yeah,
right.
Absolutely. It is a fairly easy one to use. But you got an empty table. Let's say you got 5 regs in it. You may think, well, I don't really want to play that. There's no fish, but there aren't really any games going. I'm just sitting here with 2 games up. I'm going to be playing for the next couple of hours. I might as well play it. I reckon I'm a little bit better than a couple of them. I'll make a little bit of cash. But if we were to imagine that you were of an equal skill level to them, how much money would you make, Tom, in a game with maybe what would be your ROI in a game with a 9% rake?
The 9% rate, I mean, well, you'd lose the rake, essentially. I mean, if everyone is at equal skill level, all played against each other, you know, on average, you would lose the rake.
Yeah, I mean, obviously that doesn't...
Taking out variance.
Yeah, it doesn't... taking into account variance. Your expectation is to have a minus 9% ROI in that game, and it doesn't take into account rake back. But even if you're getting 30% rake back, you're still going to have a minus 6% ROI, taking that into account. Just because a game, you know, there's no criteria that said that you should expect to win money in a game. If a game's full of regs, you will lose money. And, you know, that is just the fact of the math. If everyone's of equal skill level, everyone loses a rake.
And the fact is, I mean, it's only if you're getting more than 100% rake back can you expect to make money in that table. So unless you're a PokerStars Pro or, well, there aren't really many other cases, to be honest, I can think of.
And so you can think, well, there's 4 eggs and they're the fish. At least now I can make some money. But again, if you think about it, before you look at rake back, that fish needs to add 9% to your ROI for you to break even. And if that guy had a minus 50% ROI, maybe he gives 10% of that to each person or whatever. But it's very rare that a game with 4 eggs and a fish in it, even if he's a fairly big fish, is going to make much of a difference. And to be honest, even if there's 2 fish, that may not be enough, because it's very easy to look at. I mean, Tom, for example, you're playing a table, there's 1 player in it, he has an average ROI of minus 5%, he plays on average 600 games a week, and his average stake is $100. How much money are you going to win from him at the table?
Well, the reality of it is that he's not even losing the amount of the rake, so you're not really actually going to win any money from him at the table. He's not really giving you anything. It really takes someone with a minus 10% ROI or worse, assuming a 10% rake, for you to really gain money from them. So
maybe if there's one guy with a minus 8% ROI at $40 over a large sample, and one guy with a minus 3% ROI at high stakes over a large sample, and 3 standard regs, you're going to lose money in that game.
I mean, it is possible to win money in that game, but I mean, you've got to consider yourself better than the other regs, and you have to be getting a fairly good rakeback deal. I mean, this is why people can, in a way, go for Supernova Elite. The Battle of the Planets prizes do actually add quite a lot to the amount of money you can make on rakeback, but then again, it is subject to a whole lot of variance, because in the games you're playing, you're going to have a very, very low ROI.
Absolutely. But there's another factor to consider. There's all different kinds of regs. You can get the reg who plays lots of games. He plays $15 games and $30 games, and he plays a very tight ABC strategy across many tables. He's super exploitable. He's rubbish. You can min raise him with 100% of your range. He almost adds equity to your table, even though he's a reg, just because he's so exploitable and plays so ABC. Or you can have a top quality pro, the kind of guy with a double digits ROI at reasonable stakes. Very tough, adjusts well. You're never going to be able to exploit him, and unless you're a fantastic player, he's always going to have the edge on you. He's just a top pro, and he's going to drop your ROI a whole lot more than that other reg. It may be that if you have 3 top sharks at the game, it doesn't matter really if you got a couple of fish, even if they're minus 15% ROI, because it's just going to be a negative equity table. There's a huge difference between a low stakes break-even reg and a high stakes very winning reg.
And that is one point I think a few regs have made. Is they seem to clump regs together in the same kind of group and don't really distinguish between them to enough of a degree.
Absolutely.
Essentially, they'll see someone who's sitting on a lot of tables and just assume that they, are good.
I remember playing, I'm not going to say his name, but there was a multi-tabling high-stakes fishbowl who was on the tables a good 3 or 4 nights a week. He used to multi-table. He was an absolute godsend. He really helped keep the poker economy going. And I'd talk to other regs, and they'd say, "Why'd you jump into this game? There's, already 3 regs in it." And I'd think, hang on a sec. There's you, an alright reg. This guy who's barely a reg. I mean, low stakes. And then there's this guy who has all the playing habits of a reg, but is in fact an enormous fish, and 2 other fish. This is a really profitable table. How can you call him a reg? And that's the thing. If you just say, I need at least 2 fish, or I don't play if there's 3 regs or more than 3 regs, you can't, like Tom said, you can't clump them together. Each reg does not make the same difference to your expected ROI in that table. They can make a top reg drops it a huge amount, a rubbish reg doesn't really drop it much at all. Just like in this table, if they're mild fish, you certainly won't want to play it. But maybe if you have a couple of enormous fish bowls, enormous fish bowls.
Well, like this guy, if you've ever watched the World Series, Darwin Moon. To be fair to him, he did do fairly well, but I think he got some good cards. But this just to illustrate the point that there are a couple of pros out there who got fairly fortunate. We feel it's our own personal view.
Maybe we're just bitter.
I'm sure that's what it is.
But yeah, I mean that's the thing. Even a fish is not a fish. Like we said, a lot of players that people consider fish with their minus 7% ROIs are not fish at all, really, in terms of the money they add to you at a table. Whereas a guy who's got a minus 55% ROI at $3, he's going to add a lot of money to that table.
And it's worth saying actually that if you were more interested in kind of considering how much each reg drops your ROI by, JHub did JHub 3000. I think has got a blog, and essentially, he has detailed on the blog, what you're calculating your expected ROI from a table depending on the other opponents.
Yeah.
Although the post itself may be a couple of years old, but I remember reading it there, and that was fairly informative, and that's kind of what started us on, or at least me, on table selecting.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly, the post isn't exact, but the methodology is exactly the right way of thinking about it.
Yeah.
If you don't think about table selecting in those terms, I suggest you give it a read. It will make a big difference to your expected hourly rate.
I mean, the point here is essentially all regs aren't the same, and all fish definitely aren't the same. And not just the ROI, you should be obviously considering their average stake in working out roughly how much of a fish or how good of a reg they are.
Well, that's actually a good point, which we hadn't touched on. How do you decide these kind of things? Well, I would say that there's really 4 factors, though a couple of them are easier to obtain. So the easy to obtain ones are, well, the average stake and the average ROI. If someone has a 15% ROI at $2, it doesn't mean much. If someone has a 2% ROI at $300, it means a lot. The higher the stake, the better the player, and the more their ROI is impressive. Obviously, the higher the ROI, the better the player. If you've got a minus 10% ROI, you're always going to be a fish. If you do notice some things about the other regs, do they table select? If they're table selecting, their games are probably on average softer, and their results, like mine, are a little bit flattering. If they don't table select and they play all turbos where there's less chance for them to have a skill edge, then their results should be seen in that light, and they may be better than they appear.
And in addition to that, you've got to consider the number of games that they've played. So, for instance, you've got on Sharkscope, they've played, say, a couple hundred games and they've got 10% ROI. Okay, they may perhaps be a good player, but over 200 games, you can't be sure of that.
Yep, over that sample size, in fact, it is even fair, based on population tendencies, i.e., if an average player has played 200 games and had a 10% ROI, the fact of the matter is he's more likely to still be a fish than a good player.
Quite possibly.
I can control my results. One of the hardest things to really understand in poker is how little control you really have over how much money you make. And what it really comes down to is variance, and you'll hear so many people talk about variance and so few people spending the fraction of the time that they spend talking about it, learning about it. When you really understand variance, and it's the variance inherent in poker is the same variance in all other kinds of statistics. If you have any sort of history with statistics, you'll know exactly what we're talking about. And if you really understand variance, it can make a huge difference in making you happy when you're on a bad run.
Well, this, which we explain, this is a normal distribution of, if you, for instance, played 100,000 sample size of 2 people or twins playing, 1,000 STTs with a 7% ROI, and this is, a distribution of how many binds you would likely make compared to the probability. So you can see the peak here. You would expect to make maybe 60 binds, but there is a chance that you would lose 100 binds, although it is very, very small.
Yeah, and but this kind of follows on to what we were saying about table selection. Often you may be thinking that you're expecting a higher ROI than you can get. Often when you break down the tables that you're playing, you may find that your expected ROI, including rateback, is a lot lower in a lot of the tables than you may expect. And if your expected ROI is in fact only a couple of percent, and for a lot of high stakes players that certainly is the case, 2% ROI at $100 stake, it's not the end of the world, a couple of bucks a game, then when your ROI is low, your variance is high. And if your average stake is high, obviously the amount of swings that you'll have will be pretty enormous.
Well, yeah, you can see here essentially. I mean, this information is taken off a blog of someone called NoSD. That's also well worth reading if you want a bit of a lesson in variance. But essentially, if we look at the bottom line here, it's saying if you've got an expected ROI of 2%, if you play 10,000 games, the chance that you will lose money is 9%. and the chance that you'll earn less than half of your expected value is 25%. So you can see that, roughly 1 in 10 times, if you've got 2% ROI and you play 10,000 games, you're going to actually lose money, which is really, quite a high number, really. And when, if you're a professional poker player, you would almost certainly expect to win over that kind of sample.
Yeah, and if you've got that 2% ROI and you're over 2,000 games, you've maybe basically broken even or even lost money or only won a tiny bit. People complain, they think, oh, I've run bad, I'm so unlucky. Well, the fact of the matter is, if you're going to complain when you've lost money or when you break even or when you barely make anything, you need to understand that there's perhaps a 40% chance that will happen. Over those 2,000 games, with the ROI that you're playing, if you really look and drill deep into the games you're playing and work out your expected ROI from them, you may find out that, in fact, just a little under half the time, you're going to run as bad as you're running. And it's very hard to have sympathy because so many people complain about it, but they don't think about it in that way. Even if you're just looking at when you lose money, no one thinks, oh, over 2,000 games, I've lost money. That's just a 1 in 4 chance, c'est la vie. People complain, they feel like they're a victim. There's no compassion in variance. It's a statistical fact. It's measurable. You can't complain about variance unless you know what it is, how likely it is to affect you. And you need to understand it, and it makes it a lot easier to deal with the swings when you realise that, in fact, you're not really getting that unlucky often. It's just the fact of the matter is, maybe 30% of the time, this is going to happen to you.
And the unfortunate thing really is that the only way to counteract variance is to put in a large amount of games, get the highest sample size that you can. And unfortunately, if you haven't quite got the right mentality, if you're in a bit of a bad run, you played 5,000 games, you've broken even, you're starting to question your own game, that kind of, demotivates you and kind of has a negative impact. So it's right to kind of know what to expect so you've got the right mindset to get you through it.
Yeah, and obviously there's other problems with it. People often say, well, if I can't use my results to judge how well I'm playing, how the hell am I ever going to know how well I'm playing? Yeah, tough question. Not a great answer to that one. Every now and then, if you are feeling like you're a bit rusty, maybe if there's someone who you think is a very good player, spend a little bit on coaching. It doesn't have to cost much, just a quick brush-up session, someone who you respect their game and they can give you an overview. And don't even necessarily think about it as an investment in your game, but just as a reassurance. Your mental happiness is important. It's worth spending a couple of $100 if you're playing this 5 days a week, 35 hours a week for 12 months of the year. Spend a couple of $100 to reassure yourself and make you a lot happier when you play. You can also use things like ROI simulators to get an exact answer. You put in your buy-ins, you put in the number of games that you've played, you put in the finished positions, and it will simulate your results for you. You can just click it and see how likely you are to get within certain boundaries of results, sort of like that normal distribution graph we just looked at. There's a couple of ways in which even these do not show the full extent of variance. And one of them is that they both assume playing a constant stake. Unfortunately, if 10% of your games are high-stakes games, then your results, maybe 60% of your winnings or losses will be due to those 10% of high games. The effect of variance is hugely magnified when you mix stakes, because a small percentage of your games account for a large percentage of your results.
That's a fair point.
And another thing is sort of, as a regular or as a semi-professional, the more you play, the more you find yourself in certain spots where you feel like you know what someone's up to, but the way that you've learnt, you just can't possibly make a certain move in a certain spot with a certain hand. You can't raise the flop after someone 3-bet you with just overcards. You just can't do it. It's not good poker. But often you really need to think about it in terms of equity. One of the more classic examples is something like this, where you may think there's no way I can reship on the bubble when we're all even stacked with a hand like Jack 3 suited. And you can find a lot of reasons to talk yourself out of it. Oh, he's raised 3x, that means he's definitely not going to fold, etc., etc. But what you really want to think about is, what's his opening range? What's his calling range if I reship? Is it going to be positive EV in that case with those ranges? And what edge, if any, do I have, and how will that affect my result?
And that is all you should be thinking about.
That is exactly it. It just comes down to, is it positive money EV and the edge? based on opening ranges and calling ranges. If he's opening 100% and he's calling 10%, it doesn't matter if you got 3-2 offsuit, you just ship it in, right? There would be nothing wrong with that situation. It will win you money in the long run. It doesn't matter what your hand is if playing your hand by reshipping it here will win you money. There's nothing which says that you can only win money with premium hands. I mean, I'll take money wherever it comes from, even if it comes from an 8-4 offsuit.
The only disadvantage to that is that if you were to do that with 3-2 offsuit and you did get called because he did have, the top 10% of his range, he may have to rethink his opening range, but we won't really go into that.
No. But this is a classic spot where I think a lot of people will think maybe I can't really reship here, but if you think about it in terms of how much money will it win or lose you, then you're thinking about it the right way, and you'll find that there will be situations where someone, for example a reg, who's very aggressive and it's the first hand and he's decided to raise it up, and you know that he likes to start off bubbles very aggressive, you'll want to reship here. It will be hugely positive EV.
And the thing you can't really take into account there, which is a last point, is the future EV that you might make from having a chip advantage on the bubble.
We'll get into that, I'm sure, in a future video. That's
Sorry,
a whole other topic in itself.
I couldn't resist.
Another great example is a hand like this. Yes, it's the same opponent, but some people think that you can't bet more than pot or check raise more than pot in certain situations. Well, if you got playing an opponent who's an enormous fishbowl, and you think the situation is right, and you think that they'll never fold an overpair, they'll never fold a flush draw, they'll never fold a top pair, they'll never fold an ace king or an ace queen, then there's nothing wrong with check raising 3 times pot. Absolutely nothing wrong. Some people will say, oh, you can't raise that much, you might blast him off the hand. But if he's going to call you with that larger range, then you can just happily put in enormous overbets and get all of his chips, and that will be the most positive EV way. Notice it has nothing to do with the fact that you're check raising 3 times pot. All you're thinking is, how can I win the most money on average? And that is key. That is the way that you want to think about pretty much every hand. If you think about your hand and what position you're in, and kind of rules like I can't check raise with air and this and that, it's really going to get in the way of understanding the true fabric of poker and really being able to understand and work out where the positive expectation moves are, where are the spots and the moves that you can make that will win you money. Your hand doesn't matter. What matters is, can you play it in the most positive EV way.
And this hand here really is a classic example of exploiting a fish to the maximum, especially at the early blinds, where the pot sizes will usually dictate that you won't be able to get your whole stack in by the end of the hand. But if you're against a particular type of opponent who will call large bets, withdrawals or even marginal holdings, then really you should be thinking about how you can size your bets so that you give him decent pods to call whilst getting your stack in by the end. So I don't know what you were thinking here, Al, but I'd be thinking essentially I want to make the pot this big on the flop so that I can put in this bet which will give him these odds on the turn, and then I can obviously follow up being complete pot committed on the river. And I know there's a high chance that he's going to call these bets with some fairly weak hands. So I'm going to maximise the amount of money I'm going to make. And I'd say especially the first couple of blind levels on most format sit and goes, you can really get away with some fairly ridiculous overbets against certain people. But that is definitely the right way to play the hand against them. And it's not the same for everyone. But if you can single them out, you will massively increase the amount of money you expect to make from any given table, because you are really, preying on people's weaknesses.
Absolutely. Exploiting their tendencies. I mean, the most classic example is they'll often find a lot of fish who limp call pre-flop raises early on with aces. Ace 5, ace 6, offsuit, suited, it doesn't matter. So they limp, you raise with your ace king, they call, and the flop comes something like ace 3, 4, and you think, well, they might have 2 pair, but I'm not going to worry about that. I know they won't fold a top pair of aces here. And you stick out 3 times pot on the flop to help make the pot, make all the other bets callable so you can get all your chips in there. You think if he's got a7, he's not going to fold. The pot is 150, I'm going to shove in 400 on the first street. Looks ridiculous, but if it's going to make you the most amount of money, it's the best move. And the red line is truth. There's a common belief that your green line shows how much money you've won and lost, and your red line, or your luck adjust, your all-in EV, luck adjusted winnings. Really, they show what your results would be if there was no luck in poker. This is not true. It is true, however, that the red line is often a better indicator of your performance than the green line. But picture this situation. It's your first ever game. You're playing a heads-up game. You're nice and deep stacked. It's the very first hand. You get dealt pocket kings. You get all in with your opponent pre-flop. He's got pocket aces. Now, your red line says that you will expect to win. Let's say if the prize for winning it is $100, that your equity there is about $19, $20, because that's how often you'll win the pot. But that doesn't mean that you played it poorly. That doesn't mean that you weren't unlucky. The card distribution screwed you. And a large chunk of sit-and-goes in particular is based on card distribution. It cannot account for that. It cannot account for the time that you reship with king-queen suited and you get called by kings. But the move was a positive EV move against his range. You just happened to run into the top of someone's range. I mean, we're so often looking at spots where, someone's shoving 60%, so you should be calling 25%. And at the end of the day, you make that call, and often, very rarely, do you see the bottom of someone's range. And often you're behind, and it's a move that will reflect badly in both the green line most of the time and the red line, even though your play was fine.
And so, really, what we're trying to say is there are a lot of other immeasurable factors, inherent in variance that you may not think of, and you can't really take into account, especially displaying graphically. So card distribution is one, but another one would be essentially the finer points of card distribution. So we're talking, you're always running into the top of someone else's range, or for instance, you're playing Super Turbo 6 Max, in which case it's been said that card distribution actually plays a bigger factor in variance than all in EV. Just how lucky you are generally.
Even on those bubbles where you sit back and the other two players, even if they're fish, they get all in a couple of times, and the wrong person always wins. The bubble doesn't break, and then you get busted. That's not reflected really anywhere on either of these lines, but you can certainly count yourself unlucky that you didn't cash in that tournament. So the red line is still probably a better indicator than the green line, but it's not the truth. I've seen people who've been playing fine, whose red line and their green line have been breaking even, or even going down, and I've seen people who've won a lot of money, and their green line's gone up and their red line's gone up, and they're actually not playing that well. And I know you may say, well, how do you know that? If their red line and green line's going up, maybe you just don't understand how they're playing well. But time will often shows with these kind of things, and it's important not to think, okay, in the last week, my green line says that I've lost $2,000 and my red line says that I've lost $800. If they're both saying that and I've played 1,000 games, I must definitely be doing something very wrong because I'm playing bad poker, because even luck adjusted I'm losing. It suggests it, and that is the way a statistic works. It makes it more probable that you're making some mistakes, but by no means does it make it guaranteed. Then we come on to the last one, and I kind of tend to think that if you are playing professionally, this one is almost the most important one. The one thing that people never really seem to talk much about or think much about sometimes is the mental aspect of the game. The mental aspect of working for yourself, making yourself do something which a large chunk of the time you don't really want to do, you don't really enjoy. And you feel like you have no right to complain because you don't have to go into the office, you get to work from home, you have flexible hours. There's so many positive sides to poker, yet sometimes it can feel like more of a grind than for people who have a job. And I think a large chunk of that is due to how people set their goals. And we've looked at what you can control and what you can't control, and if you say, I want to win $100,000 this year, you can't actually control that. If you say I want to get an 8% ROI this year, you can't really control that. What you can control is how many hours you play per week and how dedicated you are to playing in the most positive EV fashion. But it's very tempting to set goals that you think will really push yourself. And if you do that, if you say, well, I've just gone pro, I'm going to play 45 hours a week, what you may find is when you first gone pro, it's great, it's the rush of playing, you love it, you're making money hand over fist, you get to work from home, it's much better than your previous job at Pizza Hut. But 45 hours a week is a huge commitment on something that is really mentally taxing, and it's something you will never be able to exceed because it's already so much. And all that means is you'll either be unhappy playing more than you really want to, more than is healthy, or you'll be unhappy because you're not making your goals which you set yourself. If you set yourself a goal and you can't possibly imagine yourself exceeding it, so if you say I'm going to play 40 hours and you can never see yourself playing more than 40 hours in any kind of week, you set your goal too high. If you want to keep your motivation up, set challenging but attainable goals. And I think one of the goals that people set the most, which is often the most wrong, is saying on the 1st of January I'm going for Supernova Elite. And it's often due to thinking about it the wrong way, thinking, well, it's a guaranteed 100,000, then it means next year I'll get lots of good rake backs, so even if the tables are tough, I'll be able to play them. But having spoken to a lot of people who have gone for Supernova Elite, some successfully, some who have not, the results can often bear out a different story. Often you'll find that, yes, people make a lot of money, but they make it just purely because of the volume that they put in. They may only be getting a $15 an hour hourly rate because of the game they have to play, not being able to table select. Yet they make a lot of money, but it's just because they're working like an absolute dog. They have to do, they don't have the flexibility, they don't enjoy their life, they just sit down on the grind and they say, well, I'm going for Supernova Elite, I've already been doing it for 6 months, I can't give up now, that would be a waste of my previous 6 months, I have to keep going. Come hell or high water, low expected ROI games, high variance, not a lot of fun times, but there's always that light at the end of the tunnel.
Well, I'd say the biggest problem with going for Supernova Elite is that usually you'll set a goal where you'll say, I want to rake this much this week. And that's fine for the first, say, 3 months. But, you will want to have a week where, you'll go on holiday or whatever, and then all of a sudden you're behind. And it's when you have to catch up. And so that's the real problem, because you'll end up having to play more and generally higher stakes. And if you find towards the end of the year, you usually get a time, well, at least there was, December, maybe the end of November, where a lot of people are going for it, and it makes it very, very challenging. Especially, mentally, where if you're playing high stakes games with a very, very low ROI, you will encounter some serious variance. And whether or not you can deal with, 7-8K swings like pretty much every day, you don't really know that at the start of the year when you start out, but you feel compelled to see it through.
Absolutely. That's absolutely the case. I remember a couple of years ago, maybe 2-3 years ago, when all the Supernova Elite chasers, this is on PokerStars by the way, it was coming to the end of the year, a lot of people clearly hadn't made it, and you were just seeing $500 turbos with 6 top quality regs popping off every 10 minutes come on the 28th and the 29th of December. It was absolutely staggering. And what you may find is that even though you have Supernova Elite, you still need to make as many VPPs next year to maintain it, so you still need to have that punishing schedule to hold on to your Supernova Elite. It's not like you've made it and then you sit back and you're chilling. The grind doesn't stop. You have almost narrowed your choices down to, I have to play lots of volume without table selecting at reasonable stakes on only PokerStars for the rest of my life, because otherwise I've wasted all this time getting Supernova Elite. I think a lot of times if people put in the same amount of hours without going for Supernova Elite, yes, they wouldn't get Supernova Elite, but if they table selected, played less games, concentrated on having a higher ROI, they would find that their hourly rate was sometimes maybe 3 or even 4 times as much. So they'd make a lot more money even though they weren't Supernova Elite for next year. But on the other hand, it's a lot easier to have a goal where there is a clear endpoint rather than a goal of, I'm going to play 35 hours a week. So it's totally understandable why people do it. But I think it's often a decision that people regret and they haven't really thought through. I often think if you're going to go for Supernova Elite, well, it's 12 months long. Set yourself a point where you say, I'm starting now, it's the 1st of January, when it comes to the 1st of March, I will stop, take a day or two off from poker, reassess how I feel, am I enjoying playing these hours, can I envisage doing it for 10 months? And not think, well, I've decided to do it, therefore I have to follow through. But when you first decide to go for Elite, or decide to go for the top of a rake race or a leaderboard, to say to yourself, I'm going to set myself this point where I'm going to reassess and really decide if this is what will make me happy, and there'll be no shame in stopping. Otherwise, you end up working all the hours God sends while maybe some of your other reg friends are making a little bit more money, and also they're just chilling. So to wrap up all the things we've looked at in this video, and it's all to do with, when you're playing serious hours for some serious amounts of cash, maybe you're semi-pro or professional, or you're looking to go pro, I can wait for a better opportunity. Really, this isn't good enough. It is correct to say that I can wait for a better opportunity, but you have to understand the way that you're thinking about this. What you're saying is, this spot is so marginal in terms of how much equity I'll win, that my skill edge in these circumstances against these opponents with these stack sizes and these blinds mean that I will get a more positive EV spot, likely than not, if I fold this one. It's not an excuse to do what you want to do and play tight and not make those marginal calls. Table selecting. It's not enough to just lump regs and fish together and have your own rules. I mean, one of the classic rules that I hear people say is, well, I only reg if there's a couple of regs, or if there's less than 3, and if there's 2 fish. But if I register first, I don't leave, because I don't want people thinking they can register over me and make me leave. And I think it's fair to say there is some validity to that way of thinking. That does make some kind of sense. Do you not agree?
Well, yeah, I totally agree. It's kind of hard if you want to play, $100 games. You will get people who obviously don't have the same table selection standards as you, and you will reg first. 3 other people will join. You then got to make that decision as to whether obviously you want to wait and see if the table somehow magically gets better, or take a bit of a hit to your pride essentially, and leave. And there is some validity to it. You would have thought that other people would have the same kind of thought processes as you and say, oh well, there's already 3 regs in there, I won't jump in 4th. But unfortunately, that isn't the case. So it is a hard one.
And often the reason given is if people know that if they register in the game, I'll leave, they can keep doing it. And I know that this is indeed the case. It happened to me and you a fair bit when we were playing. But it's also important to know who you're playing against. If a reg registers over you and you say, I'm going to defend it, that's fine. But if 2 weeks later that reg is still registering over you and he's never left the game once he's registered it, you're not achieving anything by staying in there. All you're doing is saying, I'm going to take this negative EV game because I'm not going to let him push me about. But the fact of the matter is, you want to play the game that's best for you. The only reason to be stubborn about it is if you think it might change his registering behaviour. 2 weeks in, you see that he just doesn't care at all what games he registers in. Well, you may feel like it's a hit to your pride when you just leave when he joins, but your wallet will thank you, because you're doing what is best for the amount of money that you can expect to make. You're maximising your hourly like that.
And so, what you'd want to do there essentially is if you've got a separate screen, you've got 2 screens, put the lobby on one of them. You haven't got tables on, and you'd unregister, and then you'd see who would join 5th, and then you kind of make a decision based on that.
Yeah, as soon as the table becomes worth playing, you play it. But even when you're just looking at general tables, you really need to understand how each player individually affects your expected ROI. You can't just say, I only play when there's at least 2 fish. You can't just say, I only play when there's 3 regs. There's a spectrum which goes well worse than a fish, up to an enormous fish bowl, and goes much higher than a reg to really a top professional. And each of them affects your ROI in a different way. The idea of thinking, I can control my results, it's very disconcerting once you realise how little control you can have over your results on the short to medium term. The idea that you can be playing really well in medium high stakes games, expecting a 3% ROI, and still have a 25% chance of losing money in a 3-week period or a 1-month period, is something we almost don't want to believe. When we're playing at the tables, we like to take credit for when we do good moves at work and we make money, and therefore we feel like we must take the blame when things go wrong. But in reality, over a short to medium term, you don't have much control over it. If you have a big week, believe it or not, you're just lucky. If you have a bad week, believe it or not, you're just unlucky. Unless you're a fish.
I think that's a fair point, unless you're a fish.
Yeah, you just need to understand how variance works, understand how little control you really have over your results. And then it should make it a lot easier to deal with, or just make you cry. And yeah, just the idea of not thinking outside the box, playing according to routine. If you always play in a very similar way and you don't take into account what your opponent's doing, top players pretty soon after playing with you a few times will piece you apart. I know there's lots of regs who are unbelievably exploitable because they might reship you here or they might reship you there, but they're never going to call a 3-bet pre-flop and float your continuation. They're never going to call a 3-bet pre-flop and then just float your continuation bet to see if you're going to bet the turn. They will always feel like they need some kind of hand in that spot. They'll need some kind of hand to check min raise on a flop. They have that level that they get to where they feel like they can't do something unless they have a certain strength of hand. And most of the time, that is good news. Most of the time, you will want to, follow that. But you have to understand that you are doing the most positive EV move. You have to understand the situation, your opponent, and think of it in those terms. And then suddenly a lot of outside-the-box moves, which would have seemed like bad moves and bad plays to you, you realise that when you think about your opponent's opening ranges and calling ranges and all the ranges, they're actually very profitable, and they give you an advantage over all the other regs.
I'll say a thinking point here is that essentially, I mean, for me at least, if you see some other reg who you consider to be, a good reg doing something that you consider strange, you shouldn't necessarily think, oh wow, that's a terrible move, and berate him for it. What you should really be thinking is, why has he done that? Does it make sense? Can I look into this further? And using that to bet your own game, because sometimes, although some regs will do some fairly strange things, some of them will be real eye openers.
Yeah, I remember when we were learning like 5-6 years ago. Whenever we saw a good reg, a reg better than us, do something where our initial thought was, what a fish, can't believe he did that, we'd always stop, take stock, have a look at a few of the games we'd played with him, see if he'd done it multiple times and try and work out the reason behind it, and then try and run some calculations and work out if it's positive EV. And that can really help. The red line is truth. Well, basically no, it isn't.
Although it is a better indication, it's not the word.
Yeah. I will set a goal of blah blah blah. Just be ready to first of all, set reasonable goals. Understand where you are in terms of your progression as a poker player. So often you'll see people, I've had it with people I've staked in years past, they're playing semi-professionally, you're working with them, you're coaching them, they're like, right, I'm gonna quit, I'm gonna give poker a go full time, I think I'm good enough. And they do it, and they just set ridiculous goals. They say straight away, I'm gonna play 45 hours a week because I was working 40 hours a week at my job and there was, this much time commuting and I much prefer poker. And what they don't understand is you got to do what's going to be sustainable if you're going to do it for many years and what will keep you happy. You don't just think about the money that you're going to win, you think about the quality of life that you're going to have. Set reasonable goals and also be prepared to review and change them to make sure that you remain happy. And I think that's one of the most important ones.
I would agree. I mean, the fact is, people will say, I come out of a job, I was working 35, 40 hours a week. If you try and translate that into playing poker, I mean, I'd say it's so much more mentally challenging. At a job, you can obviously go and have a break, have a coffee, chat to your work colleagues, maybe go on the internet, do a bit of browsing. If you're playing poker and you're looking to maximise your hourly rate, you're literally going to sit down, boot up as many tables as you can for maybe 6 hours in straight. At least that's what obviously I do and what Al does. And that really is mentally taxing. I mean, you'll find yourself, if you push that to say 8 hours, you kind of find yourself begin to drop off. So
yeah, I know that when we were putting in long sessions, the reason why we'd put in long sessions is because you lose a lot of time, a lot of equity starting up your tables because you're not playing as many tables as you can, and the tables you have to take are not as profitable because you don't have any. You need to load 12 up. So we like to play one long session. And I remember before, we played some really, really long sessions, and afterwards your brain just didn't really functioning well enough to speak properly.
No, I remember you couldn't actually focus once.
Oh yeah. That was many years ago. I don't think I'd play a session like that now.
No, that was 12 hours.
Yeah. But set reasonable goals, be prepared to review them, be prepared to change them. Have a look at yourself from the outside and think, am I happy doing this? Do I really care about this goal? What's a nice balance? What's a nice work-life balance?
And I think that's the important thing, really. In order to play good poker, you're going to have to be happy.
Yeah. There's lots of people, they come in, they hit it hard, they hit a bad streak, they start playing even more because they've set goals of I want to make this much money, and they burn out and they stop. And a lot of people burn out in this game because they push it too hard early on, and then when it starts to go wrong, they don't understand the variant, they don't understand the table selection, they don't understand how to take a step back. and that's an important thing to do. You have to remain happy when you're playing if you're looking at playing for many years. That's all we have time for this week, but next week we're going to look at really the most important thing when you're playing poker professionally or semi-professionally, which is how can sit and goes make me rich? What's the way that I can maximise my hourly rate from them, and what's the way that I can make sure that my hourly rate keeps going up the more I play? So we'll have a good look at that, look at what things are worth investing in, at what point it's worth getting another monitor, what software is worth buying, when it's worth buying it, when you should get coaching, all of those things. And we'll also have a look at some hands which really take that attitude that you need to have in terms of looking at it very professionally and taking that onto the tables to help you make some non-standard decisions. So it should be good. So again, thank you for joining us. I hope you found this video useful. I'd be interested to hear any comments you may have. You can post them by the video. Until next time, from me, our MD261 McLenaghan.
And me, Tom Loose Willis.
We'll see you next week.